I was gone for exactly 3 days. Not 3 weeks, not long enough for seasons to change. Just 3 quiet days on a fishing trip where my phone barely had a signal, and the biggest decision I had to make was whether to keep casting or call a night. Then I came home, and someone had started building a garage across the only driveway leading to my house. I actually sat there with my truck still running, staring through the windshield, wondering if I'd somehow taken the wrong turn, because nothing prepares you for seeing concrete where your road used to be. The funny thing is, when you've lived somewhere long enough, your brain memorizes every little detail without you realizing it. The old cedar fence leaning a little farther every winter, the creek that always flooded just enough in the spring to make you nervous, the pair of oak trees standing like they were guarding the entrance. Everything was exactly where it had always been, except right in the middle of my driveway sat a fresh concrete foundation with steel rebar sticking out of it like broken ribs. I killed the engine, climbed out, and just stood there. It was so absurd that I almost laughed. I remember saying out loud, even though nobody was around to hear it, "Well, that's new. My name's Grant Holloway." At least that's the name that matters for this story. I'm 53 years old, divorced, no kids, and I've spent the last 12 years living on 8 acres tucked into the hills outside Ashford Ridge, Tennessee. Most people drive through this county without noticing it exists, and honestly, that's exactly why I bought the place. I wasn't trying to escape people. I was trying to escape noise. After 25 years managing commercial construction projects around Nashville, I'd had enough meetings, enough deadlines, enough phones ringing every 5 minutes. I wanted mornings where the loudest thing I'd hear was a woodpecker pounding on a tree or the wind moving through the pines. That's what I found out here. That gravel driveway wasn't just part of the property. It was the property. It curved almost 400 feet through the trees before reaching my cabin, and there wasn't another legal way in or out. No back entrance. No county road on the opposite side. Just that single stretch of gravel that had been there since sometime in the early 80s. While I bought the land back in 2014, I paid extra for a full professional survey because I'd spent enough years in construction to know property line disputes could turn ugly fast. The survey stakes were clear, the paperwork was crystal clear, and every inch of that driveway belonged to me. For over a decade, nobody questioned it. Every spring, I'd spread fresh gravel. After storms, I'd clear fallen branches with my chainsaw. When heavy rain carved ruts into it, I'd spend weekends smoothing everything back out. You take care of land long enough, and it starts feeling less like ownership and more like stewardship. Then the empty lot next door finally sold. A young couple from Charlotte bought it. Their names were Mason and Olivia Brooks. The first time I met Mason, he pulled into my driveway in a brand new black pickup that looked cleaner than my kitchen counter. He rolled down the window, wearing mirrored sunglasses, and smiled like we were already friends. "Morning," he called. "You must be the neighbor." "I suppose I am." He climbed out, introduced himself, shook my hand with both of his like politicians do during election season. He asked about winters, wildlife, internet service, whether bears ever wandered through. Perfectly normal questions. Olivia seemed nice too. She talked about wanting fresh air, raising chickens someday, planting a garden. Honestly, I liked them. I even remember telling an old friend over the phone that maybe I'd finally gotten lucky with neighbors. Looking back now, that conversation almost makes me laugh. About 7 weeks later, after my fishing trip, I was standing in front of a concrete foundation blocking my only road home. I finally pulled out my phone and called Mason. He answered on the second ring like he'd been expecting me. "Hey, Grant. No hositación. No surprise. Just calm." I skipped the small talk. "Mason, why is there a garage sitting on my driveway?" There was a pause. Not a confused pause. The kind of pause someone takes while deciding how much truth they're willing to tell. Then he sighed. "Oh yeah, about that. Oh yeah, about that." Mason finally said, like he was remembering he'd forgotten to return a borrowed ladder. "Our contractor measured everything from the counter marker. Turns out the garage needed to shift over a little." I stared at the concrete while he talked, trying to make sense of words that refused to fit reality. "Shift over." I repeated. "Mason, it's sitting across my driveway. I can't even get to my own house." Another pause. Then he laughed softly, almost awkwardly. Well, you can still get in. Just cut through the trees for now. It's temporary. Temporary. Funny how people use that word when they're asking someone else to live with their mistake. I looked at the thick woods surrounding the road. There's no road through those trees. You'll figure something out, he replied. Besides, we're already this far into construction. That sentence changed everything. Up until then, I honestly believed we were dealing with some huge misunderstanding. The moment he said that, I realized this wasn't confusion anymore. This was a decision. You're building on my property, I said, keeping my voice steadier than I felt. You need to stop. His tone cooled immediately. If you think we're wrong, take it to court. Click. He hung up. I stood there listening to the silence after the call ended, and somehow it was louder than the conversation had been. That evening, I spread my survey documents across my kitchen table. I'd looked at them before when I bought the property, but this time I studied every line, every measurement, every notation like I was cramming for an exam. There was in black and white. My driveway wasn't close to the property line. It wasn't partially on an easement. It wasn't ambiguous. The entire thing sat well inside my land. The next morning, I called an attorney named Russell Garner, an older local lawyer who'd spent 30 years handling property disputes across 3 counties. He listened without interrupting while I explained everything. When I finished, he asked one question. Do you still have a survey? Every page. Email it to me. An hour later, my phone rang again. Grant, he said, this isn't complicated. They're trespassing, and they've blocked the only legal access to your residence. We're sending a formal demand letter today. How long do we give them? 10 days. If they have any common sense, they'll stop immediately. I thanked him and honestly believed the whole thing would end right there. Surely once lawyers became involved, someone would realize how serious this was. I couldn't have been more wrong. 3 days later, I walked down the path I'd hacked through the woods just to check the construction site. Instead of stopping, they'd accelerated. Framing lumber covered the ground. Nail guns echoed through the trees. Half a dozen workers moved around like they were building on perfectly legal land. None of them knew any better. They were just doing their jobs. Mason stood nearby holding a rolled-up set of blueprints, pointing toward the roofline while talking with the foreman. He noticed me walking over and smiled. That smile bothered me more than anything else. Morning, he called. Looks like you got our attorney's letter, I said. Sure did. Yet you're still building. He shrugged. My lawyer says until a judge tells us to stop, construction continues. I looked around at the growing structure. Every board they nailed into place somehow felt personal, even though it wasn't. You're gambling with a very expensive mistake. He folded his arms. Or maybe you're making this into something bigger than it needs to be. I couldn't help laughing. Not because it was funny, because sometimes the only alternative is yelling. Bigger than it needs to be? I asked. You blocked the only road to my house. We've actually been talking about that, he said quickly, almost excited. We got an idea. Whenever someone says they've got an idea about your property, it rarely ends well. He unrolled one of the plans across the hood of his truck. Instead of tearing everything down, you could let us keep the garage here. We'd pay you for an easement. Then we'd redesign your driveway, so it curves around the building. Honestly, it'd probably look better than before. I stared at the drawing for several seconds before looking back at him. You build on my land without asking. Our contractor, you build on my land, I repeated. And now you're offering to redesign my property, so your mistake becomes permanent. His smile disappeared. We're trying to be reasonable. No, Yensuarat Kietli. You're trying to make me solve a problem you created. For the first time since we'd met, neither of us spoke. We just stood there looking at each other while hammers echoed behind us. Finally, he rolled the plans back up. Then I guess the court can decide. I guess it can. I turned around and walked away before either of us said something we'd regret. That night, Russell called again. They're still building? Faster than ever. He sighed. Then we stopped asking nicely. The next morning, he filed for emergency injunctive relief, requesting that the court halt construction before the damage became even worse. Legal paperwork moves slower than emotions, though. While we waited for a hearing date, life kept happening. Every morning, I parked my truck beside the county road, climbed out carrying groceries, tools, or whatever else I needed, then hike nearly 400 feet through uneven woods just to reach my own front door. It sounds manageable until you've done it 30 or 40 times. Then it becomes exhausting. I started documenting everything. Photos every morning, videos every afternoon, timestamps, construction progress. Russell told me judges love facts more than feelings, so I gave him facts. One afternoon, while I was taking pictures, Olivia walked over. She wasn't wearing the confident smile she'd had when they first moved in. She looked tired. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Sure." She glanced toward the workers before lowering her voice. "I don't think this has gone the way either of us expected." "No," I agreed. "It hasn't." She took a slow breath. "Mason really believes the contractor caused all of this. Does he?" I asked. She hesitated long enough to answer without words. "I think." She finally said, "I think once the concrete was poured, he stopped worrying about who was right and started worrying about how much it would cost to admit he was wrong." That sentence stayed with me, because I'd managed construction projects for decades. I'd seen million-dollar mistakes happen. The first instinct is almost always the same. Don't stop. Keep going. Maybe it'll somehow work itself out. Pride has a strange way of disguising itself as optimism. "It's not too late," I told her. "You can still tear it down yourselves." She gave me the saddest little smile. "I've tried telling him that." And she looked toward the half-finished garage. "He says if he backs down now, we'll lose everything we invested." I nodded slowly. "Maybe." Then I looked directly at her. "But if he doesn't, he's going to lose anyway." 3 days later, Russell called with the news we'd been waiting for. "We have a hearing next Tuesday." I looked through my kitchen window toward the block driveway. The walls were finished now. Roof trusses had already been delivered. They were racing the calendar. So were we. And deep down, I had the strange feeling that no matter who won in court, nobody living on that road was ever going to feel like neighbors again. By the time Tuesday morning arrived, I hadn't slept much. It wasn't because I doubted the survey or the law. It was because I'd lived long enough to know those two things don't always travel at the same speed. You could be 100% right and still spend months paying for someone else's bad decision. I drove into Ashford Ridge before sunrise, met Russell outside the courthouse, and the first thing he said was, "Just answer the questions. Don't try to win the room." I smiled. Wasn't planning on giving a speech. "Good," he replied. "Judges like facts. Leave the drama outside." Funny enough, the drama was already waiting for us. Mason stood across the parking lot wearing a tailored blazer that looked completely out of place in our little county courthouse. Beside him was Olivia, hands stuffed in her coat pockets, looking more nervous than angry. We nodded at each other, but nobody spoke. Whatever conversation we might have had weeks earlier had already been replaced by lawyers and paperwork. Inside, the hearing moved faster than I expected. Russell laid everything out with calm precision. Survey maps, property records, photos showing the garage blocking my only legal access, daily construction updates proving they continued building after receiving formal notice. Then Mason's attorney stood up. I'll give a man credit. He was smooth. He argued that the contractor had made the measurements in good faith, that removing a nearly completed structure would create an unreasonable financial burden, and once again suggested negotiating an easement. Sitting there, I almost laughed. It amazed me that after everything, their solution was still asking me to permanently sacrifice my own property so they wouldn't have to admit they were wrong. The judge remained quiet until both attorneys finished. Then he adjusted his glasses, looked down at the survey one last time, and finally spoke. The boundary is not in dispute. Those 6 words changed the atmosphere in the courtroom. You could almost feel the air shift. He continued. The defendants had a responsibility to verify their property lines before construction began. Reliance on a contractor does not transfer that responsibility. Mason stared straight ahead without blinking. The judge folded his hands. The structure substantially interferes with the plaintiff's sole means of accessing his residence. Therefore, the court orders the complete removal of the structure within 14 days. Then came the sentence none of us expected to hear, stated so plainly. If the defendants fail to comply, the plaintiff is authorized to arrange for demolition at the defendant's expense. One tap of the gavel. And just like that, months of arguing became a court order. Outside the courthouse, Mason caught up with me before I reached my truck. "You're really gonna make us tear it down?" he asked. I looked at him for a long second. "No, Ian Sorath. The judge already did." His jaw tightened. "This isn't over." "It could be," I said quietly. "You still got 14 days to do the right thing." He turned away without answering. Olivia lingered another moment. "I'm sorry," she said so softly I almost missed it. Then she followed him to their truck. For the first few days after the hearing, nothing happened. No construcción, no demolition, just silence. Every morning, I'd drive to the entrance of my block driveway, hoping to see equipment taking the garage apart. Every morning, it looked exactly the same. Day 5, nothing. Day 9, nothing. Day 14 came and went without so much as a hammer swinging. They made their choice. On the morning of day 15, I called a demolition contractor named Hector Alvarez. We'd already talked after the hearing, just in case. I handed him a certified copy of the court order, and before climbing into his excavator, he looked at me and asked, "You absolutely sure?" I took one last look at the garage. Weeks earlier, it had filled me with anger. Standing there that morning, all I felt was exhaustion. "Yeah," I said, "I'm sure." The first strike wasn't dramatic. It was almost disappointingly ordinary. The bucket pressed into one wall, wood splintered with a deep cracking sound, and suddenly the whole structure began folding into itself. Roof trusses snapped, plywood crumpled, concrete fractured under the machine's weight. It took months to create the problem, and less than 6 hours to erase it. About halfway through, a pickup came flying down the county road, tires throwing gravel everywhere. Mason jumped out before it stopped moving. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted over the sound of the excavator. Hector shut the machine down for a moment and looked toward me. I walked over, reached inside my jacket, and handed Mason the court order. He grabbed it, read the highlighted paragraph, and I watched something change in his face. The anger didn't disappear. It just collapsed under the weight of reality. "You had 14 days, I said. "This didn't have to happen." He looked past me at what remained of the garage, then down at the paperwork again. For several seconds, he didn't say a single word. Olivia stepped out of the passenger side and quietly stood beside him. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply closed her eyes for a moment like she'd already imagined this scene 100 times. By late afternoon, the driveway was clear again. It wasn't pretty. Broken concrete still needed hauling away. Fresh gravel had to be spread, and the ground looked like it had survived a small war. But for the first time in weeks, I could drive all the way to my front porch. A month later, Mason filed another lawsuit seeking compensation for the demolished garage. It lasted about as long as a snowstorm in April. The same judge dismissed it, ordered him to reimburse my legal expenses, and required him to pay additional costs for repairing the damage left behind on my property. Legally speaking, that was the end of the story. Personally, not quite. We still live next to each other today. There's no shouting anymore. No lawsuits. No late-night arguments across the property line. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that feels completely different from the peaceful silence I moved here to find. Sometimes I'll see Mason working in his yard, carefully measuring every fence post now, and I'll catch myself wondering whether either of us truly won. I got my driveway back. He learned an expensive lesson, but somewhere between pride, stubbornness, and a few bad decisions, two neighbors who might have become lifelong friends ended up becoming strangers living a few hundred feet apart. Maybe there was another path. Maybe there wasn't. What I know for certain is this: boundaries matter, not just the ones marked on survey maps, but the invisible ones built on honesty, respect, and the willingness to admit when we've crossed a line. So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you had been standing in my boots, would you have hired the demolition crew the very first day the court allowed it? Or would you have given Mason one last chance? Was this justice, or did pride win on both sides? Share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this are never really finished until everyone has had their say.